Hello everyone, my name is Emma Sivi. I'm the advocacy coordinator of the Coalition for the Abolition of Prostitution. I am moderating the panel Last Girl First, Prostitution at the Intersection of Sexist, Racist and Class-Based Oppression. Last Girl First. It is a concept that has been developed by the Indian activist Ruchira Gupta, and it takes roots into the anti-colonialist fights and in the fight of Gandhi and Ambedkar for equality. Last Girl First means that when taking the public decisions, the interests of the last persons should be taken into account. Today, with this panel, we're answering the question of why are the most marginalized in our society overrepresented in prostitution. I am happy to give the floor to Maria Dimitrieva. First question. Maria, in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Can you tell us more about how the war impacted prostitution in your country?
Thank you, Hema. Okay, hello again, everybody. My name is Maria Dmitrieva. I'm a radical feminist and women's rights trainer from Ukraine. So I come here from Ukraine. I will be back going in 2 days, so. Okay, I want to start with my deepest gratitude to the Ukrainian armed forces that are fighting against the genocidal imperialist Russia and allowing me to do my advocacy and awareness raising work. If it were not for them, I would be here. I will answer your question, Hema, by first giving a brief piece of historical context. Then I will outline the situation with prostitution before the war, which started in 2014. This is when Russia invaded Ukraine. They annexed Crimea and parts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. So the war has been going on more than Second World War. So I will outline the situation with prostitution before the war, and I will conclude with the current state of affairs. I will try to be extremely brief. So, let's start with the Russian Empire. By its final years, second in its territory and might only to the British Empire, it had a population that was largely illiterate, and women's wages and employment opportunities were generally so low that 1/3 of adult female population in the Russian Empire were engaged in prostitution in this or that form. It was either legal prostitution in brothels, illegal prostitution in the streets, or escort. You name it, it was there. And the state treated these women as a threat and a source of disease and moral degradation. Most, if not all, ended in prostitution through coercion, force, lies, or to avoid starvation. Women from the peoples conquered or destroyed by the Russian Empire often ended in prostitution too. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which held the other half of Ukraine, the prostitution was legal as well. After the massive women's demonstration in February 1917, the liberals took over and granted suffrage to all, along with other civil rights. But it was the Soviets who overthrew the liberals, that legislated women with the means and tools to support themselves. Equal access to education, same wages and employment rights as men, childcare and support and medical services. The Soviets saw the women in prostitution as vulnerable and exploited. And I'm no apologist to the Soviet regime. And as its survivor, I find Western young people wearing t-shirts with Soviet symbols to be ignorant and lacking in empathy. And I grant you permission to tell those people that those t-shirts are extremely bad taste. But in mere 3 years, the number of women in prostitution went from 1/3 of the adult population to less than 2%. Why I'm mentioning this? This shows us that unlike sex workers' statements that prostitution is inevitable and it cannot be reduced, it shows us that with the right tools, it can be curbed and it is not inevitable. Still, I haven't seen the research on whether these measures reduce the overall men's violence against women in the Soviet Union. So we know that from this experience that when women have the means to support themselves, they have better chances to avoid prostitution. So let's skip the rest of the Soviet regime and get to the independent Ukraine. So the rapid liberalization of economy imposed on Western advisors and international organizations brought about the collapse of the industrial system, which rendered a lot of people jobless. The same institutions demanded that Ukraine cuts down its financially poor but extensive social state infrastructure, leaving vulnerable people with no support. This was when the women of Ukraine became a hot commodity for international traffickers. While trafficking had been addressed by the legislation and actual work by the government, prostitution was left ignored. Ukraine decriminalized prostitution in 2006. Since then, it has been an administrative offense with a fine of a couple of dollars worth. But it allowed the police still to blackmail women in prostitution into providing them services, you know, right? Selling drugs or sharing their earnings. So it was a racketeering scheme. There is no official data on the numbers of women in prostitution in Ukraine. Only HIV servicing organizations keep it, and in their reports, they call the women in prostitution commercial sex women. They don't include men in prostitution in the numbers. These men are listed under men having sex with men. Their data also doesn't include underage persons. According to their data in 2010s, the estimated number of prostitution was about 80,000. For a population of the country of 42 million, it was not that much, especially with so many people living below poverty line. So these organizations provide women with psychological counseling and tools for harm reduction, like condoms and lubricants. There are no exit services offered. The war began in 2014, and it displaced a lot of people, up to 3 million. A lot of women lost their housing, property, work, social support networks, and became more vulnerable to traffickers and pimps. Women and children in the occupied territories were forced into sexual slavery and pornography. According to unofficial assessments, up to a third of all child sexual abuse materials on Darknet before the invasion was coming from the occupied Ukrainian territories. But nobody talks about this and nobody mentioned this. The numbers of women in prostitution accounted by HIV servicing organization grew to more than 100,000 persons. This is the data from 2017. Starting from 2015, the Ukrainian members of parliament tried to introduce legalization to legalize prostitution several times. And for now, we have been able to stop them through awareness raising and public events. We have been trying to introduce the equality model in our legislation, and we had some support from the Ministry of Internal Affairs and from the Ministry of Social Policy, but failed to gather enough support from members of parliament. Still, we are working on this. So, the invasion, we finally got to the invasion. The invasion made things significantly worse on all fronts. More than 6 million Ukrainian citizens left the country, mostly women and children, and about 4 million more have been internally displaced. Ukrainian authorities estimated that Russia forcefully took about 1 million, including up to 30,000 children, which also falls under the definition of genocide. The International Red Cross participated in this illegal relocation. So when International Red Cross asks you for money for Ukrainian refugees, don't give it to them. They don't deserve it. After the news of Russian atrocities in the Ukrainian occupied areas broke, the demand for Ukrainian women in prostitution and for rape of Ukrainian women in pornography spiked several times, like 600 times more like. And where is demand, there is supply. Ukrainian women and girls are targeted both online and offline for brothels, for escort, for porn, both in Ukraine and abroad. As an aside, there are 2 sex workers organizations in Ukraine. One pushes for legalization, and the other one pushes for the equality model. We worked a lot with them, so they are now on our side, and so they are our partner in many activities. So based on their estimates, the number of women in prostitution is much more than HIV servicing organization count. There are women who engage in prostitution part-time to supplement their little income, some who previously exited and had to return to it. Some don't acknowledge that what they do is prostitution. Some engage in transactional sex on the occupied territories or in gray areas for protection, for food, for medication, for drugs, or to save their daughters from rape. And this makes our work to get the equality model introduced in Ukraine ever so difficult but more pressing. And we need our neighboring countries in Europe and elsewhere to adopt the equality model as well, to protect Ukrainian refugees, refugees from other conflicts, vulnerable women and girls in their countries. If they haven't done so, it's high time they do it now. I also want to mention the surrogacy industry, profitable in Ukraine before the invasion, has been actively advertising itself to Western clientele as offering, and I quote here, white presenting women for their needs. And we need to ban surrogacy because it's sale of babies and reproductive exploitation of women. Thank you.
I have another question for you, Maria, very briefly. We saw that the OSCE published a report saying that there was an increase of 600% of research putting together the words Ukrainian, refugee, and escorts in Europe since the war. Can you tell us very briefly how the war has impacted the demand for trafficking for sexual exploitation?
We see a huge growth in demand for Ukrainian women or for women who look like Ukrainian women in Europe and elsewhere. And it is confirmed by the research done online, and we see that they are targeted specifically survivor groups. Like brothels invite women, especially women with small children, to stay with them and maybe try it out, maybe it will work for them. So they don't even pretend that it's something else. But I will use this opportunity to say that there is at least one international document that is obligatory for all countries who are members of the UN, which is United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, which demands that countries curb the sexual exploitation of vulnerable populations in conflict. And because it is obligatory for all countries, it can be included in the country reports on CEDAW. The CEDAW has this separate article on prostitution, but it doesn't require the countries to introduce the equality model. But prostitution and prostitution in conflict zone falls squarely in between, not in between, in the crossroads of women peace security, of CEDAW, and sustainable development goals. And it also falls under NATO documents on zero tolerance towards sexual exploitation and towards trafficking. So if we take these all documents into account, it falls squarely that countries have to adopt the equality model to address the issue of prostitution in conflict and outside of it. Because currently, I'm finishing, conflict-related sexual violence doesn't include willing prostitution. It only has forced prostitution. But what free will can a woman exercise on the occupied areas when there aren't men coming for her or for her daughter? So we need to include prostitution per se into the definition of conflict-related sexual violence, and we need to include the needs of refugee and migrant women in national action plans on women, peace and security. This works for Europe, this works for everybody else too. So I really hope we will be able to address Security Council on this topic, and this is one of our advocacy goals for the next future. Thank you.
Maria has traveled for 3 days from Ukraine to join this conference, so thank you very much. Our next speaker is Melanie Thompson, the Advocacy Coordinator of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women and a survivor leader. Melanie, thank you for being with us. I have 2 questions for you. My first one is, can you tell us more about the impact of the prostitution system on the most marginalized communities in the US?
Hello everybody. If you did not get a chance to meet me yesterday, my name is Melanie Thompson. I'm a survivor of prostitution who was trafficked from the age of 12 years old. And absolutely, so I think it's no secret to everybody in this room that the system of prostitution is one that is predicated on racism, classism, sexism, patriarchy, all of the isms. And it's no different than it is in the US as well. One of the ways, the biggest way I should say, that the system of prostitution prostitution impacts the most marginalized groups is that it disproportionately affects women and girls, folks who are brown, indigenous, black, LGBT folks, and women primarily. And specifically for black women in the country, in the US, we make up less than 6% of the population in total, but in the population of those in prostitution, we account for over 90% in the United States. So when we talk about disproportionality, it is very, very common to see faces that look like mine that are represented in the sex trade. Another way that we see the way that the sex trade targets, specifically in the United States, marginalized groups is that traffickers and sex buyers, because we need to name them, they prey on the vulnerability for those that are culturally specific. And what I mean by that is the system of prostitution targets individuals that fall into these categories. And it's not just racial either. It also includes those that are in foster care systems, those that are abandoned or orphaned, those that are homeless or unhoused, those that run away under the age of 18, and so on and so forth. It's also one of the categories of marginalization that we don't talk about is anybody with a prior sexual, it's not working, anybody with a prior sexual abuse history. So if you have been sexually assaulted at least one time in your lifetime, you are 7 times more susceptible to being trafficked in the United States. So going off of those vulnerabilities, what we tend to find is that there are a lot of traffickers that will target individuals based on their communities. So they're living in impoverished communities that are that live below the poverty line. If they're going to Asian-specific communities, Black-specific communities, things of that nature. So we know that this is not to say that folks who identify as white in the United States are not impacted by prostitution. Thank you. Hopefully that's better. Is this better? Oh yeah, that's better. Okay. It's not to say that folks that identify as white are not impacted by prostitution. We know nationally and globally, prostitution sees no color and it can affect any single person. Anybody in this room can be susceptible, but it's super, super imperative that we call out the disproportionality. And what we know is that traffickers tend to target us based on where we live, if it's a historically Black neighborhood, if it's historically economically poor, and so on and so forth. And what we're seeing right now in my state of New York, specifically in New York City, we're seeing culturally specific areas being targeted, where there are primarily a lot of migrant women that have now come into our state, including those in the Asian population, and going into those erotic massage parlors and brothels and so on and so forth. We also see the specific targeting for group home settings. So again, that category of marginalization that's least talked about when we talk about those that are in foster care, those who have run away, those who are a ward of the state, as we call it. So any kind of state-owned agency that is responsible for the caring of young people or people under the age of 21, you'll find a lot of traffickers and buyers tend to target those areas. I think it's important to highlight some of the demographics that we see here in the United States. This actually, I believe, applies globally, but in the US for sure, the majority of people who are the perpetrators, those who are purchasing sexual acts, are predominantly middle-aged white men with disposable income, usually making an annual salary of $100,000 or more per year, where the majority, as I mentioned, of the people that they are purchasing are people that are Black, brown, indigenous, LGBTQ+ identifying. I think it's important to note that while Black individuals make up over 90 to 95+% of those that are in the sex trade, we also have over 45% of indigenous individuals in the US that are trafficked, and out of that, over 40% that are LGBTQ+ identifying, and that intersects with a lot of foster care, homelessness, and so on and so forth. So when I mention that, I think it's super, super important to note that this is not, the system of prostitution, human trafficking, sex trafficking, this is not about sex. This is not about sexual gratification. This is about an abuse of power and authority. And I think that we need to call that out for what it is, because when we're talking about violence, right? This is not about an orgasm. This is not about you know, the man who just wants to get off because they're just sexual in nature and men will be men. That's not the reality. The reality is it will continue to target marginalized individuals because it's about who has the power and who has the least power. And unfortunately, all marginalized categories, women, children, young men, those who are LGBTQ plus identifying, and all the other isms, we fall into the category of people with the less power. So the system of prostitution continues to target us in that way. And lastly, I just want to say, and I think this is never highlighted enough when we talk about the system in the United States, it also contributes to a mass incarceration system. In the United States, we have a mass incarceration system of Black and brown bodies in general, and I can go on for days about those injustices, but specifically, we don't talk about how traffickers will use the predominantly women that they held captive to commit other crimes. And I think it will go into my next question why that's important, but we often become reoffenders or charged with other crimes in addition to prostitution, which therefore leads to further marginalization and keeping us in those areas of having a lack of resources and a lack of power. So I wanted to highlight how important this domino effect or pyramid effect or trickle-down system is, because it starts with targeting those who look like me, who fall into these categories, and the reason that it targets marginalized groups in particular is because the demand buyers and traffickers see those with less resources as disposable. They think that nobody cares about us, so it's a lot easier to subdue and take away the power from somebody that they deem powerless. And that's how we end up falling into these categories, and in the US, we're the ones that are the most targeted.
Melanie, you are a big supporter of the equality model and an advocate for it. I wanted to ask you if you can answer briefly on how the equality model actually tackles the discriminations that you just mentioned, whether sexism, racism, class domination.
Absolutely. So anybody who knows me knows that I'm a big proponent for the equality model. I often say that the equality model is the only way to go. We know globally that there are many different legislative approaches to this model. We know that currently in the United States, we have criminalization in all 50 states, with the exception of a few counties where legal brothels are available in Nevada. We all know criminalization doesn't work for many different reasons, right? I talked about the mass incarceration system and so many other things. I believe no survivor, no person in prostitution should be criminalized for their exploitation. So we know criminalization doesn't work. We know that there is proposed full decriminalization where all parties involved would have no consequences of any kind. And I think it's safe to say that everybody in this room knows that that would not be great. We know that that would lead to more chaos and therefore an increase in trafficking. I won't get into that now, but if you're interested in how that happens, just find me afterwards. And then we know, of course, there's legalization in places like Amsterdam and Germany, and so on and so forth. So we know that those don't work. So what the equality model does, it's an attempt to put us, the folks who are marginalized, first. It's the only model that actually attempts to focus on the aftercare service component, which if you heard me speak yesterday, you know that aftercare services to me is the most important part of the survivor's healing journey. It's the only proposed model that even focuses on that. It sees us not as criminals, and that, again, criminalization is what contributes to keeping us marginalized. Under the equality model, it removes any prior criminal convictions, so that's a first step in the right direction to allowing survivors to rebuild their lives. It upholds the laws that we currently have for perpetrators, those that are perpetuating the system of prostitution. And then there's also this small component that is that will contribute to the victim compensation fund, where they'll be finding sex buyers based on their income on a sliding scale and taking that money after they harm somebody and putting it back into victim compensation services. There's a lot more to that bill, but these are some of the reasons why, even though it may not be 100% be-all answer, it's the first step in the right direction, and therefore is the only one that we should all in this room be supporting.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for your powerful analysis. We're now going to our next speaker, Suzanne Jay. who is the co-founder and a collective member of Asian Women for Equality. The Asian Women for Equality collective has campaigned for 18 years in Canada against pimps, sex buyers, and sex industry lobbyists. Suzanne, can you explain to us how does the prostitution of Asian women look like in Canada, and what are the forces at play?
Thank you, Hema. I'm going to answer your question with a story. So in Canada, the first person to be charged with human trafficking was a Chinese man. He had Canadian citizenship. So he ran a massage parlor. It was a storefront operation in a strip mall, shoulder to shoulder with a couple of popular family restaurants and shops. It was in a working class part of the city of Vancouver. And he recruited women by going to China. He would use a combination of romancing some of the women, getting to know their families, and he also promised women jobs in restaurants that he said he owned. He arranged fake marriages, and he forged documents which he confiscated when the women arrived in Vancouver. He used the women's family connections to recruit new women, other family members, family friends. He used these connections to control the women because he knew how much the families needed the money. Sometimes he hand-delivered the money to women's parents, and then he would come back and with news about how much to that woman, about how much they needed that cash, how grateful they were to her for what she was doing. And he was only arrested after he beat, choked, and threatened to kill 2 of the women because one of them said that she didn't want to do this anymore. They ran out into the street in this very busy Vancouver neighborhood where someone saw them and saw that one of the women was bleeding. And they were both very distressed. And it was that person, or those people, who called the police. And the women didn't speak very much English, of course. And in China, which is a totalitarian state, you want mostly to avoid the police. So they would never have called the police themselves. You might think that that would be the end of the massage parlor. He was tried and convicted. I think he served 7 years. But that location continues to operate in that strip mall, and it never really closed. It didn't close down for very long. There was another brothel manager lined up to take over that business almost immediately. So the prostitution of Asian women is an international industry. Globalization, domestic economic policies of countries like China and the Philippines and many other Asian countries rely on prostitution for economic development. Military operations, peacekeeping operations, large-scale resource extraction operations, sports tourism, they all bring together huge groups of men who need to be controlled and distracted, and prostitution does that. Poverty, thousands of years of sexism that prefers boy children over girl children, and now climate-related disasters mean that Asian families push girls and women into the arms of the recruiters and the pimps. Male supremacy means that women are expected to willingly sacrifice ourselves for the sake of husbands, brothers, fathers, and sons, and we do. We meet that expectation. Asian women are packaged and marketed like products. We are advertised and stereotyped in ways that are deeply racist and expose the racist sexual experience that men are looking for. So you'll have seen these phrases. Commonly used phrases still include China doll, geisha, sexy Thai model, Japanese schoolgirl. They offer men the girlfriend experience. We're described as eager to please and docile. And in their online discussion forums, the sex buyers love to refer to the managers of the brothels, especially if they're women, as mama-sans, which just reinforces that our purpose is to serve men and to be served up to men, including by our mother figures. So the prostitution of Asian women is highly organized and controlled. Organized crime groups in every major city are networked across Canada and are running drugs, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and prostitution. For decades, in my province of British Columbia, at least, these guys laundered hundreds of millions of dollars through our casinos, all while our provincial government discouraged police investigations into why people were coming into casinos with duffel bags full of bills to gamble. And municipal governments issued business licenses for massage parlors and health enhancement centers and ignored house-based gambling and prostitution operations. So that's a little bit about what it looks like and some of the forces at play.
Today, we witness everywhere in the world movements that defend work, that defend prostitution as an acceptable form of work for marginalized communities. We'd be very interested to hear your insights about this.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about two specific strategies that are in play right now. There's a strategy that is being promoted by academics. Well, actually, you're all quite familiar with it. We've been talking about the migrant sex worker phenomenon. So this is a strategy that's promoted by academics and by the political left wing to define prostitution and prostituted women, but especially, I think, Asian women as workers. The vocabulary of sex workers used to talk about us, and they've invented this concept. We are, in North America, very predisposed to this framing because we have a long history of racialized men coming here as temporary workers, and racialized women as well. They come here, do the work we don't want to do, and then we expect them to go once we don't need them anymore. So we have academics publishing, teaching, and getting tenure by telling men the lies that they want to hear. That prostitution is work like any other occupation, and that Asian women are eager to be in prostitution, and that we derive huge benefits from prostitution. But framing women as migrant sex workers basically hides the human trafficking that is a crucial component to almost all prostitution. And the people who benefit the most from reframing prostituted Asian women as migrant workers are the men. As always, with these strategies, the pimps, the sex work buyers, and the prostitution promoters get the most benefit. And in fact, in this framing, they become heroes because they are the ones giving women the opportunity and the means to work and have clients. And the sex buyers become generous patrons, helping disadvantaged women earn an honest living and support their families. So one example of this strategy is that there are groups trying to change Canadian immigration law right now. Currently, if you visit Canada on any type of visa, you're not permitted to be employed in the sex industry. But sex industry groups are lobbying to get rid of that restriction. And this change would be a really big help to the pimps who could basically paving the way for them to bring women in on a temporary basis. So the second example is about licensing of massage parlors and health enhancement centers. So this licensing is done at the city level. And elected members of city councils across Canada, either they don't understand or they don't care that the federal law that we have on prostitution means that they don't have to give these operations a business license. They don't have to allow them to operate because what they're doing is actually illegal. So, but when you give an operation a license, it forces municipal staff to be complicit because they have to sell someone the license, and then that license gets displayed, and it makes it look legitimate, which discourages the average person walking by from questioning the business. And it also means it's almost impossible to get the police to investigate any kind of complaint about these businesses, except, you know, maybe if women are running out frantic and bleeding into the street. So what's happening now is that there are several cities in different provinces in Canada that have they're actually have tried to reduce the number of street front or retail prostitution operations in their towns. But when a city councilor raises the issue of even looking at these licenses, when they raise the issue of maybe we shouldn't be doing this, or what exactly, or they start to ask questions about what's happening in these businesses, pro-prostitution groups, a couple of them representing themselves as representing Asian sex workers, will immediately attack the individual counselor and accuse them of being racist. And you know, some of what they say is true, that women are desperate, that they need money, but the solution is to rebrand the women as migrant sex workers and to argue that the city councilors and the police just need to let women go do their business. And they almost all, these pro-prostitution, these pro-pimp lobbyists almost always get very sympathetic, almost promotional media coverage for what they're saying. And lots of left-leaning politicians regular people are very eager to appear progressive and supportive of disadvantaged women. But it's become absurd. In Edmonton, where they decided several years ago that they would treat prostitution as work, as a job like any other, they are now discussing how they need to change the wording of the licenses from exotic massage to erotic massage, because exotic is racist, and they want to remove the stigma from the sex work. So I'm going to wrap it up by saying that we organize as Asian women because we know it is crucial for us to be drivers and designers of our own liberation. As women, we can't trust that those who are in the oppressor group, we can't trust that men, no matter how mild-mannered, kind, sympathetic, we can't trust that they're even able to put women's interests first, because women struggle to put women's interests first. And we are all trained in ways to hold up male supremacy. So this revolution that we're in together, it has to be led by feminists. It has to be led by women.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for your insights and for your great contribution. Our next speaker is you are the co-founder of the co-president of European Network of Migrant Women and a feminist lawyer. Noura, the European Network of Migrant Women is an organization that does a lot of advocacy work for migrant women in the EU. Can you speak about how the prostitution system specifically impacts migrant women?
Thank you, Emma. So I will switch to French. Merci. Donc, d'abord, je tiens à remercier toutes les organisatrices de ce congrès. Et les survivantes aussi, c'est difficile, il faut le dire, de prendre la parole après les survivantes. Mais je pense que c'est un travail aussi en parallèle d'avoir les personnes donc, sur le terrain et des personnes qui vont être sur le plaidoyer. Et je remercie toutes les femmes qui ont été présentes à la marche hier parce que c'était vraiment une marche magnifique, c'était de l'énergie positive et c'est un début d'une révolution féministe aussi comme l'a bien dit Suzanne. Il est important, nous considérons pour nous, le réseau européen des femmes migrantes, de se réunir avec des alliés, des personnes abolitionnistes, des femmes abolitionnistes, de réaffirmer nos valeurs et nos luttes et de trouver des stratégies également pour protéger nos droits qui, nous savons très bien malheureusement, ce sont des droits qui ne sont pas acquis et qu'à n'importe quel moment ça peut être remis en question. Même si c'est malheureux de dire qu'aujourd'hui, en 2024, on doit encore, nous les femmes, à ce stade, devoir militer et combattre pour que nous demandons qu'on soit libre, tout simplement, de toutes les violences, y compris de l'exploitation sexuelle. Et par rapport à la question de la stratégie du travail en commun, nous tenons, nous, le réseau européen des femmes migrantes, à remercier Rim Salem, la rapporteuse spéciale aux Nations Unies, du rapport énorme et du travail qui a été mené. c'est important, c'est un rapport qui pour la première fois va évoquer, va utiliser les termes, la bonne terminologie, et puis qui va établir ce lien entre la prostitution et les violences qui sont faites aux filles et aux femmes. Donc vous l'avez très bien compris, je suis aujourd'hui ici en tant que coprésidente du réseau européen des femmes migrantes. Le réseau européen est une organisation féministe, nous sommes des féministes radicales, nous sommes abolitionnistes. Nous visibilisons les voix des filles et des femmes migrantes. Nous sommes majoritairement des femmes migrantes au sein du réseau. Nous défendons les droits des filles et des femmes migrantes et nous luttons contre toutes les discriminations, les violences sexistes et sexuelles qui sont commises contre les filles et les femmes migrantes en raison de leur sexe. Et nous considérons que l'abolitionnisme est, en fait, c'est la priorité, c'est important en tant que féministe de le dire et de le pratiquer, de lutter contre le système prostitutionnel, l'exploitation et la gestation pour autrui qui, pareil, va permettre d'utiliser, en fait, aux hommes, de leur permettre d'utiliser les corps des filles et des femmes, et spécialement les filles et les femmes migrantes, parce que nous savons que ces systèmes d'exploitation sexuelle se nourrissent de la sexualisation et de la racialisation de la pauvreté en ciblant les femmes en premier. Et donc les premières malheureusement qui sont touchées sont les filles et les femmes migrantes qui sont issues de milieux marginalisés, qui sont issues de milieux minoritaires et qui sont parfois exposées par les hommes dans ces milieux-là pour pouvoir par la suite les exploiter. Donc, les femmes migrantes sont les plus exposées à ces types de violences et discriminations en raison de leur sexe en tant que femmes, mais aussi de leur statut de migrante. Elles sont exposées à plusieurs obstacles et violences parce que, il faut le dire, on fait encore face à des systèmes qui ne prennent pas en compte les vécus et les histoires de ces femmes, ni leur situation. Elles font face à des systèmes machistes qui vont parfois ne leur permettent même pas l'accès aux droits fondamentaux. Et d'ailleurs, sur ce point, le réseau européen des femmes migrantes a travaillé sur des recherches sur 7 pays européens sur l'accès aux droits fondamentaux des femmes migrantes. Et on voit très bien que même si juridiquement, dans certains pays européens, nous avons des droits et nous avons un accès égal aux droits pour toutes les femmes, nous voyons que les femmes migrantes n'ont même pas accès aux droits fondamentaux en raison de différentes barrières comme la langue, l'accès à l'information, les mauvaises interprétations au niveau juridique, la mauvaise interprétation des lois au niveau judiciaire et plein d'autres barrières. Et malheureusement, ces femmes sont encore le groupe le plus exploité partout. En Europe, aujourd'hui, plus de 70% des femmes qui sont exploitées dans la prostitution sont des femmes migrantes. Et malheureusement, vous l'avez très bien compris, quand on est exploité, quand on n'a pas accès aux droits fondamentaux, donc ces femmes ne sont même pas représentées, et quand on n'a pas cet accès à la prise de décision, on ne peut pas avoir plus de droits, on ne peut pas en fait avancer. C'est pour cette raison que nous saluons le fait que des femmes puissent prendre des postes de prise de décision, des femmes, des féministes, pour faire entendre les voix d'autres femmes, et notamment les femmes migrantes. Les filles et les femmes migrantes sont encore les plus touchées par l'exploitation sexuelle en raison de la vulnérabilité dans laquelle elles se trouvent ou à laquelle elles sont exposées, que ce soit dans leur pays d'origine ou bien lors du parcours migratoire ou dans le pays de destination. Et c'est le cas des femmes qui sont victimes des violences sexuelles, des violences sexistes, de l'exploitation sexuelle dans les conflits armés, dans les guerres. C'est le cas des femmes qui fuient les guerres et qui sont utilisées par la suite par les hommes comme armes de guerre, mais également dans les pays de destination pour faire de l'argent en contrepartie de leur trouver un hébergement ou d'autres contreparties. C'est le cas, donc, comme Maria l'a rappelé, des femmes ukrainiennes dernièrement, sur la guerre contre l'Ukraine. C'est le cas également des femmes qui quittent leur pays à la recherche juste d'un meilleur avenir ou bien à la recherche d'une société où elles vont pouvoir poursuivre leurs études ou juste pour fuir des violences patriarcales, de fuir un mariage forcé, de fuir des mutilations sexuelles féminines et qui vont se retrouver emprisonnées dans un cycle de violence et d'exploitation sexuelle en contrepartie, donc soit du financement de leur parcours pour arriver au pays de destination ou bien par la suite dans le pays de destination pour financer leurs études ou bien pour les aider à avancer. On sait très bien que ces filles et ces femmes sont les plus exposées au système d'exploitation en profitant de de leur situation. Et souvent, ces femmes méconnaissent la langue, encore une fois, et n'ont aucun accès aux informations et aux droits. C'est le cas aussi parce qu'on parle souvent de parcours migratoires, on parle souvent de femmes qui sont victimes de la traite des êtres humains dans le cadre de la prostitution. Mais il ne faut pas oublier que les dernières années nous ont aussi montré que les femmes qui arrivent dans le cadre du regroupement familial, les femmes qui arrivent pour rejoindre un conjoint dans des pays, notamment en Europe, ces femmes se retrouvent dans le cadre du mariage complètement, totalement dépendantes administrativement et juridiquement de leur conjoint. Le conjoint qui va confisquer le passeport, le conjoint qui va profiter de leur situation de vulnérabilité et donc ce conjoint qui va pas hésiter à exploiter sa conjointe pour avoir de l'argent et donc en échange, en lui faisant de chantage par rapport à l'hébergement ou par rapport à la question de la situation administrative dans le pays de destination. Nous avons notamment observé ce schéma d'exploitation lors de la crise, alors ça ne veut pas dire que ça n'existait pas, mais ça a exploité lors de la crise sanitaire du Covid, quand notamment les femmes migrantes se sont retrouvées, qui ont été victimes de violences au sein du couple, elles se sont retrouvées du jour au lendemain à la rue, sans hébergement, sans papier, sans aucun droit et sans accès à l'information. Et ce sont ces femmes qui ont été prises en otage par les proxénètes et par les trafiquants, malheureusement. Donc nous faisons face aujourd'hui à des sociétés qui tolèrent encore aux hommes d'utiliser les femmes. Et nous faisons face aussi à des systèmes qui alimentent cette exploitation sexuelle des femmes parce que on doit oser le dire, il s'agit de systèmes juridiques, administratifs et judiciaires qui sont encore faits par les hommes et pour les hommes. Et tant que ces systèmes ne se fondent pas sur des principes féministes, tant que ces systèmes ne se fondent pas sur des principes féministes, sur nos principes féministes, parce que nous avons vécu ça, nous connaissons la situation, nous avons de l'expérience, tant qu'ils ne prennent pas en compte les origines du patriarcat, le statut des femmes, leur vécu, leurs expériences, et tant que nous, les féministes, nous ne prenons pas des positions de poste et décisionnelles, nous ne pourrons pas combattre ni les violences sexistes et sexuelles, ni l'exploitation sexuelle contre les filles et les femmes. Donc aujourd'hui, alors juste pour finir, il est vrai que ce sont les filles et les femmes migrantes qui sont le plus marginalisées et utilisées dans l'exploitation sexuelle, mais autant que Réseau européen des femmes migrantes, nous souhaitons rappeler que c'est avant tout lié à notre condition en tant que femme. C'est le fait d'être une femme et appartenir au sexe féminin et que cette société patriarcale et capitaliste permet aux hommes de contrôler nos corps, de contrôler les corps des âmes, de les utiliser et de les exploiter. Et donc c'est un combat à mener en commun toutes les femmes, peu importe nos origines, peu importe notre race, notre ethnie, notre couleur, c'est un combat à mener ensemble en tant que femmes pour notre autonomie, libération et protection. On ne pourra pas avancer si quelque part dans le monde il y a encore des filles et des femmes qui sont utilisées dans les mariages forcés, dans les mutilations, dans les exploitations sexuelles. Et on ne pourra pas avancer si nous ne défendons pas un seul système harmonisé qui lutte contre les violences masculines, un système qui est comme le système, donc le modèle nordique, qui va permettre aux femmes de trouver une issue, parce que la prostitution n'a jamais été un choix, mais les femmes ont juste besoin d'être protégées, d'être en sécurité et d'être indépendantes économiquement, financièrement et administrativement. Et donc, pour le réseau, il est important au final de rappeler qu'il faut qu'on ait toutes un discours en commun, cohérent, et d'utiliser surtout la même et la bonne terminologie, parce que les termes ont aussi un sens et ça reflète notre idéologie, notre lutte et notre combat. Il est important que nous continuions à revendiquer le système abolitionniste, le modèle nordique qui va protéger les droits de toutes les femmes, les droits fondés sur le sexe, des femmes et des filles, et qui pénalise les exploiteurs, les abuseurs et les violeurs. Merci.
Thank you so much to Melanie Thompson, Maria Dimitrieva, Suzanne Jay, and Noura Rad for speaking truth to power and showing that the fight for the abolition of prostitution is a fight for every last girl to be first until there are no more last and no more first. Thank you.